Man, what's up, guys? Man, I'm so excited for week 2 of our series. We're going to be in Proverbs chapter 5 tonight. If you have a Bible, I invite you to turn there as we dive into this passage together. We're going to be in Proverbs 5 for the next 2 weeks together, actually. And to kind of set up the reading of God's Word tonight, a few years ago, I was able to go see my dad. Hadn't seen him in a while. And I was actually met him at my granny's house on his side. I've seen her like a dozen times throughout my life. And so I'm there, and he, somewhere in the conversation, he brings up guns. And I'm like, I like powerful things. And so he starts showing me his gun collection, and he pulls out this pump shotgun, and I noticed it still has the tags on it from when he bought it, and I was like, oh, and he just says, yeah, I bought this one on a whim, actually. I've never used it. It's never even been loaded or anything like that. And then he goes, actually, do you want it? And I was like, do I want it? Yeah. And so I was looking at this thing. I'm looking down the sights, and I pump it just to feel the action, I guess. And I was looking for the release to undo the pump, however you say that, where the pump would be released, where it's no longer cocked and ready to shoot. Well, he goes, well, I can't. I said, Dad, I don't know where the release button is for the pump. And he goes, oh, don't worry, it's never even been loaded. Just pull the trigger. And so I'm inside of my 9-year-old granny's house, and so I point the gun up, and I take his advice. And I pull the trigger, and it goes, bow! And there's debris falling from the ceiling in this moment. My daughter's around me, like, I put my hand, like, across her chest. I just hear her heart going. Like, my granny's just rocking in her chair. And I look at him, and I was like, what? It's loaded, dude. And he goes, oh, I guess I did loan that to your uncle once. And in this moment, like, of course, like, if you're a gun person in here, you're like, you should have acted like it was loaded no matter what anybody says. And I get that lesson, and I'll hopefully never, ever, ever fail to make sure there's no ammo, regardless of who says, and the tags are on it. It doesn't matter. Now, the reason why I set that up is because the way you handle a gun really matters, right? It's this powerful thing. The way you handle it really, really matters. Well, our sexuality is kind of like that. In the sense of it's a powerful thing. Sex is this powerful thing. And how you handle this topic, it really matters. It can lead, just like the misuse of a firearm it could be great harm, or it can be something that's really helpful. And sex is this thing that it could lead to great blessing and health and good things, or it can lead to harm and hurt in a person's life, depending on how you approach it. And just like there's advice that we get, man, like I got the wrong advice in that moment. We get all kinds of advice from a lot of different places in our culture on how we're to approach this topic of our sexuality. And with all the voices leaning in, why don't we lean into the voice of God? That's why we're doing this series. Say, God, you tell me what you think. Especially on this topic where there's so many voices speaking on this. Like, we are in such a hyper-sexualized culture. Like, I was just scrolling, and one of the ads that popped up was for yogurt. And here's the yogurt ad that I saw. I just couldn't believe it. Somehow, they found out a way to sexualize yogurt. And so I just couldn't believe that was an actual ad. And I guess just like they tell you in advertising, sex sells, apparently. But I also came across this one as I was scrolling as well. And I really only share that one just because I'm a fan, you could say, of a good dad joke. And I might be the only fan, you could say. But hey, when people groan, it makes me want to share them more. But joking aside, the way we approach this topic really matters tonight as we spend 2 weeks in the book of Proverbs in chapter 5. we're going to break it up into two sections. Tonight, we're going to see the dangers of sexual sin. And next week, man, I hope that you'll come back because we're going to be talking about the blessing of God's good design of sex and how he intended it. It was his idea. And so tonight, the passage we're reading, it is a pretty intense passage, just heads up. But we're going to end tonight by looking at the redemption of Jesus when it comes to this topic. But Proverbs 5, Chapter 5, verses 1 through 14, let's read it together. It's in the context of a father speaking to his son. He says, "My son, be attentive to my wisdom. Incline your ear to my understanding, that you may keep discretion, and your lips may guard knowledge." And then it says this, "For the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil." In Proverbs, it uses something called personification. And so this is lust personified in this passage through this woman leading this young man astray. So the lips of the forbidden woman in this picture is dripping honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. It says, "But in the end, she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, and her steps follow the path to Sheol, which is the place of the dead. She does not ponder the path of life. Her ways wander, and she does not know it. And now, O sons, listen to me, and do not depart from the words of my mouth. Keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house, lest you give your honor to others and your years to the merciless, lest strangers take their fill of your strength, and your labors go to the house of a foreigner. And at the end of your life, you groan, when your flesh and your body are consumed, and you say, 'How I hated discipline, and my heart despised reproof. I did not listen to the voice of my teachers or incline my ear to my instructors. I am at the brink of utter ruin in the assembled congregation.'" So in this intense reading, gives us this crazy picture. What do we learn from this? What we're going to see tonight is where lust leads us. Where lust leads us, and then in this passage we see how do we fight it? How do we battle? Whenever I say lust, I use lust or sexual sin throughout this message interchangeably. And let me just give you a good working definition, because a lot of people are like, "What's lust? What does that actually mean? What is sexual sin actually?" I would say this. So outside of marriage, any act in thought or action that gratifies sexual desire is sexual sin or lust. That's the working definition. That's biblically what it means to be in the arena of sexual sin. So with that said, we're going to see where lust leads. And the first point this evening is lust leads first to deception. Lust leads us to this place of being deceived. And it says that her lips, of the forbidden woman's lips, drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil, which represents, in the Old Testament, often represents gladness and prosperity, meaning that it's saying it's got something good for you in the moment. And it's this picture of being overcome by the senses in the moment of temptation. It looks good, it smells good, it sounds good, it tastes good. And don't hear me wrong, like the temptation itself is not the sin. It's choosing to give into it, where you fall into lust. And in the moment where all the senses are firing on all cylinders, that's the moment that you want to give in the most to sexual temptation in your life and fall into lust. It just, when the senses are all firing, that's when it makes most sense. It really does. Like that's when in your moment of temptation, you're like, I just want to give in. And this is where the deception lies. And it plays out in so many different ways. And many of these are true in my own life, and I'm sure true across this room. But you're kissing, and she says, "Hey, do you want to go to my room?" Like, what do you say in that moment? After you've been dating a little while, he says, "Hey, I love you, and that's why I want to take the next step in having sex together." Do you stick to your values and your boundaries, or do you give in to that moment in the feeling in the moment? You're in your room alone, and in isolation, you are tempted again to go and scroll and look at pornography, even though you know it hasn't done anything good in your life, but you're tempted here, and you're battling in this moment. Do I give in or not. You've been dating a while, and this is natural, I would say. This is like the natural progression. When you're dating for a while, you've been together for a long time, especially when you step into things like engagement and having those kinds of conversations. You want to be connected on every level, including physical. And you think, why should I say no? If it feels so right, then how could this actually be so wrong? Is a thought that many people have in all of these situations. See, there's this gravitational pull towards sexual sin and towards temptation. And this is where it becomes difficult, because in those moments, lust is deceptive and it lies to us. And we've got to learn to spot that lie. Whenever I was running from God, I actually fell into the most wild living part of my life, and I would say I was actually saved. I was just, the way I've communicated to people is that, I was a child of God, I was just being a really bad kid, if that makes sense. And so that's kind of where I was at in my own life. And as I was running from the Lord, especially in this area, and just giving over to whatever the pleasure was in the moment, I remember at this point in time, Rascal Flatts was popular, so there's a Rascal Flatts concert. And my friends, they're a country band, if you don't know who they are. I don't know if they're even popular anymore. But Rascal Flatts was playing in Dallas, and my friends had some drugs. They had some cocaine, so we're like, man, let's do cocaine, let's go, and then we'll drink all day and have fun at the Rascal Flatts concert. And so we did that. We get there, and man, it just seemed like this great time. Music was awesome. I'm having a great time. At least what I would say in that moment, what I thought was a great time. And there were girls behind us. They happened to be from the same kind of area that we were. And so I asked the girl if I could buy her a drink, and she said yes. And then we're listening to country concert and all that stuff. And I'm like, this is great, kiss me. And she's like, I'll kiss you. And so we start kissing and all that stuff. And one thing happens after another, and I find myself at her house that night. And there's a lot of people that, man, in that season of my life, guys that I was hanging out with, that actually they were celebratory about those kinds of moments. But whenever I think back about moments like that, it actually it causes me to have this pit in my stomach. It makes me feel like almost physically sick, because I remember just how empty I was. I remember the life I was living, breaking myself and others along the way. But I would have said the reason why the condition of my soul was, it was just one little step at a time that I got there. But man, I believed this lie. What's the lie that I believe? What's the deceptive lie? And it's the deceptive lie that all of us believe, and it's so simple. But it's this, and all of us have fallen victim to it. Here's the lie: sin will satisfy. Sin will satisfy. It's that simple. That's what I believed. I believed it would satisfy. I believed that God was just trying to be a killjoy, keeping me from pleasure. And I was buying into that lie. Here's what I learned over the years. Here's what God has taught me through the school of hard knocks. And I've heard this quote several different times from several different people. And man, I just believe it's true. God taught me this: what breaks God's heart will never satisfy yours. What breaks the heart of God will not satisfy mine. Sexual sin, it breaks God's heart because He designed sex for a very, very special purpose in a special context, which we're going to talk about that next week, in the blessing of His design and the goodness of His design. But what I was falling into is that deceiving lie that God was trying to keep me from pleasure. And I bought the lie. And lust, that's what it does. It leads to deception. And then ultimately in this passage, the reason why it's kind of a tough read is because what we see play by play, lust leads ultimately to destruction. Going outside God's design for our sexuality, it leads to destruction. Notice that it starts out with her lips dripping honey. It's this sweet thing. But it says in the end, she's bitter as wormwood. So it starts out as this sweet thing, and it ends in this place of bitterness. It's this sweet thing that can make you sick. And it starts, though, like with this place of passion. It starts in this place of fun. It just doesn't start there. Like this, it gets pretty intense. It talks about how it's the bitter place. It's the path of Sheol, the path of death. Like this just isn't, it doesn't on the front end tell you that you're going to go down this path that's going to lead to a place you don't want to be. Like it's not, if I was like, hey guys, you guys want to sign up to go and hang out with me this weekend? We're going to go to Sheol together. And you're like, well, I don't even know what that is. I'm like, place of the dead. It's going to be fantastic. No one's signing up. It doesn't start there. There's a hidden cost. It's one step at a time, and we don't see the hidden cost. 10 years ago or so, my wife and I, we'd been married for a few years, and I was going through our bank statement, and I noticed this charge. And I don't know if you go through your bank statement, it's pretty good practice to do. But you know how sometimes when you go through your bank statement, things are coded weird, like it doesn't tell you exactly where you were when you bought said thing. And so it was coded in a very weird way, and it was $50 or so. And so I was like, Carrie, where's this from? Where's this purchase from? She was like, I don't know. So I start scrolling through all of our bank statements month after month. And every single month on the day, $50 is taken out. And 2 years later, there were still being $50. So for 2 years, we had a charge for $50. And so I'm making all these calls, and I'm like, man, this is expensive. This is a lot of money. I'm like, Carrie, are you sure? I was like, I don't know what it is. And so I made like 3 or 4 calls. Somebody connected me to another person who connected me to another person. And then I finally got my answer. I was on the phone, and the lady goes, sir, I found out where the charge is coming from every single month. And she goes, it's from Fabletics, sir. And I turned to my wife, and I was like, do you know what Fabletics is? And she was like, yeah, it's like women's tights. You know, like leggings, right? Like, so she talked about leggings. That's what I call them, women's tights, whatever. I don't, all I knew is I paid them a lot of money. And she was like, oh, no, I got this really good deal once from them. And I was like, oh, do you think you did? Okay, tell me about that deal. And she was like, yeah, so I got this deal. You sign up for like the email or whatever. I'm like, yeah, maybe not. Maybe it was more than an email. What do you think? And she goes, well, so it was you buy one and you get one for signing up. Not knowing that we were signing up for a subscription that we would have to pay for $50 every single month for 2 years. So we had a lot of money to buy tights with, is what I'm trying to say. And if you're wondering, we did get through that season with a lot of counseling and therapy. But she didn't see, and I didn't see the hidden subscription. I didn't see the hidden cost that was there. And this is how sexual sin works in our life. We don't see the hidden subscription that's going to lead to a high cost that we pay little by little by little, that we're getting set up to be robbed by the enemy. And maybe you're here and you're like, man, like, is it really that serious? Like, is this passage, like, isn't this a little old school? Does this not even seem a little bit like fear-mongering? Are we sure that this is what we're going to believe? It's like, anybody watch Mean Girls? It's like the coach in Mean Girls when he's like, if you have sex, you will get chlamydia and die. And we're like, is it really that hardcore? Is it really that serious? I don't think so. And so I just want to talk about that for a few minutes. I want to give 4 ways that sexual sin actually does make us sick. And this is what he's trying to say with it being bitter as wormwood and leading to this path of death in our life. It has this decay effect on our life. One, just culture at large. I would say this, man, like, I actually heard, there was a podcast I was listening to. There was a debate happening on this podcast. Very popular, has like 4-point-something million subscribers. So a very popular podcast, and very popular with young adults and college students. And there was people on there that were advocating, saying it is okay for somebody to watch AI, child pornography, because it's not real kids. And I just couldn't believe that was even something that was a conversation happening, but this is where we're at. Like because they're saying like, yeah, they can feed that part of their desires, but they don't actually like do an act to a child. And I'm like, there are certain cravings that should never be fed. But that's where our culture is. And the reason why our culture is having conversations like that is because, man, when you leave the light of God, you venture further and further into the darkness. And this is what's happening because we have left the light of Jesus, and Jesus saying, would you let him shine on this topic for us in this room? Because it's not only culture at large, it's also us. Like we find ourselves in this spiritually sick place because of sexual sin. Like this passage says it's sharp as a double-edged sword. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18 says it this way. It says, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body. And here's what makes sexual sin unique. Whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Like when you sin sexually, you actually hurt you. You're sinning against yourself. Now, how? Well, a few ways. One, whenever you give yourself over to somebody sexually, it makes, if and when the breakup happens, it makes it more difficult. And even whenever I was in that party phase, me and guys would have conversations about how sex was complicating things. I actually had a conversation with somebody a few years ago, and she was speaking about how she had lost a couple of her cousins in a tragic car accident and how close she was and had the pain of that. And she was relating it to this guy who she had given herself over to in every single way, and he treated her, mistreated her, and things came to an end. It was a terrible breakup. And she said the pain of that breakup, the sensation of the tearing of my heart was similar to whenever I lost my two cousins. It's the pain of death, is what she was describing. And I've had many people talk about the difficulty of that breakup, especially whenever you've given yourself to somebody sexually. And maybe you're here and you're going, well, that's not like I'm not physically having sex with someone. Maybe you've never physically actually had sex with somebody. But at the same time, all of us, to some degree or another, at least most of us in the room, struggle with just lust in general. And specifically, the avenue that many people struggle with, the stats are extremely high, is the avenue of pornography. And I just want to say, man, pornography usage, it's harmful to the user. Actually, there's a guy named Lawrence V. Tucker. He's with the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. And he did some study on this, and there's a picture I want to show you. So the left is what would be a healthy brain. The middle is somebody's brain who's on heroin, a hard drug, and then pornography. Someone that's addicted to pornography, it's wildly similar to somebody who's on a hard drug. And he talked about a lot of what the image that you see, like what everything lit up means. But suffice it to say, it's a highly, highly addictive. The same parts of the brain that light up when somebody's addicted to heroin is the same parts that light up for somebody that's addicted to pornography. And also, I want to say this, that porn addiction is similar to a hard drug in that it follows the law of diminishing return. So what is the law of diminishing return? Well, simply put, it's this. So if somebody does something like, say, a drug, so someone does cocaine, so they'll do a line of cocaine, and they'll feel the effect from that line. Well, as they continue to do more and more cocaine, that line no longer gives them the effect that it once did, so now they got to go from one line to two lines. See, the effect had diminished. Does that make sense? So this is the law of diminishing return. Pornography usage is similar to that in that it starts with something that used to work for somebody. Now, you got to go just a little bit more hardcore. You got to go get just a little darker. And this is why there's so many crazy things that you see on porn sites today as far as different genres that you can look at. And that's because of the law of diminishing return. It's hurting you. It's hurting you. And I want to tell you that there's freedom if you say yes to Jesus and start following some steps, and he can even break you free starting tonight. But it's hurting. a lot of people. Sexual sin, ultimately, it leads us to being in this place of being numb to God. For me, that's what happened. I felt bad for a little bit, but then I just was like, but I'm just going to keep going. Like, it's something that I want to do, so I'm going to do that. And little by little, I became more and more numb to the Lord in my life. I was like this half-filled glass, thinking that diving into sexual pleasure would satisfy and fill up the rest of that glass. But what happened was, as I dove into sexual sin, I just became less and less filled, and the other people that I was with became less and less whole. And that's the lifestyle that I was in. I have seen this take effect in my own life. And ultimately, this passage, this personification of lust, and this woman leading this young man down to death, you see something very clearly, and that's this: sexual sin is selfish. You see this in verse 5 and 6. Her feet go down to death. Her steps follow the path to Sheol. She does not ponder the path of life. Her ways wander, and she does not know it. Sexual sin, lust, wants nothing for you and everything from you. It only wants to rob little by little from us. So if this is true, then how do we battle this? Like, how do we fight this? When this is what this passage teaches, and this is the unique thing. It's not, man, take the gloves off and start swinging, that metaphor. No, it actually says that we are to keep our distance. The best defense is actually distance. That's what it teaches in verse 7 and 8. It says, "And now, O sons, listen to me, and do not depart from the words of my mouth. Keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house." The best defense is distance. You keep from pain by cutting off the path when it comes to sexual sin. So what does it look like to cut off the path of lust? Well, you want to ask, where does this path lead? That's what this proverb, this book of wisdom literature, is trying to teach us, to ask the good question: where does this path lead? Where does this path end? We need to learn to not just ask what's now, but what's next. Start thinking from a zoomed out perspective, so we can see where this leads. Like eventually our story's going to be written and finished. What do you want your story to read? How do you want your story to read? Zoom out and think about these things. And then to get really, really practical, like, you have clearly defined boundaries. You have clearly defined boundaries. Like, when it comes to dating relationships, you want to have boundaries that are defined clearly and early. Clearly and early. And I just want to say here, I said the person that says, I love you, and that's why I want to have sex with you. Listen, like Carrie and I, we were abstinent for 4 years of dating in our relationship, but we did fall into lust several times, and we had to fight that. But in those moments that we were falling into sexual sin and lust, although it wasn't sex, I wasn't doing that because I loved her. Listen, I was doing that because I wanted to feed me. Somebody who asks you to sin with them against God doesn't love you. Somebody who says, would you go with me against what God wants for you, doesn't love you. That is not an act of love. They're not loving you in that moment, at least, just like I wasn't loving her in that moment. And I'm not saying God can't redeem. Like, if you've really struggled, if you're here, and maybe you're here as a couple, I don't know, and you're here and you're at this series because you're like, man, we do want to follow God's design, and we have all kinds of struggles that God's trying to help us through. Hey, God can redeem, and you can start to follow his path from this night forward. But falling into lust is not ever an act of love. And so you want to have clearly defined boundaries, and you want to define them early on. And again, I'm not trying to get weird here. I'm not trying to be like, the it's just dessert. Like they're like, yeah, so what are your sexual boundaries? And it's like, that's a weird conversation. And so you don't need to be like that, but you do need to have that conversation as you start to date somebody. Because temptation's like a magnet, in that the closer a magnet gets to metal, the more the pull towards that metal increases to attach. And sexual sin is like that the closer you get to that line of falling into temptation, the more intense the pull gets to do so. And that's why you want to have boundaries defined clearly, and you want to have them early. And then if you find yourself struggling to keep those boundaries, here's what you have to. Here's what we did. Here's what me and Carrie would do in our own relationship. Like we would say, hey, we have to stop. You would say it out loud, we have to stop. And then we would invite God in through prayer. And so I'd be like, God, Lord, Carrie really likes me, God. So you got to help her. I'm joking. I never prayed that prayer. But I did pray that God would help us together battle this thing because we wanted to go God's way, because we believe that God actually has our good in mind and his design is best. And then we would move. This is something that we had to learn through a process of figuring it out. We had to actually move from the place we were at. And that was a really good thing. And maybe that's something that you need to start doing to make sure you stay away. Like the best defense, again, is distance. You don't want to go near the door of lust. And so where do you need boundaries? Do you have them? Where do you need to apply them for your current relationship or future relationship? And if you're here and you're struggling with pornography, I want to tell you again, man, freedom is possible, but step one would be confession. That you would tell somebody here tonight, like we get to have the pleasure of walking people through steps of freedom to be porn-free the rest of their life if they will just say yes to Jesus in these areas. And we would love to sit down and chat with you, but it starts with you going, hey, I have this thing that has a hold on me, and I want to get free. And you need to get blocks on your phone before you leave tonight, so that's no longer a place where you can just easily stumble when you're alone in isolation. And then this is such a simple one, but it just is so needed that I'll just say it. Your dating pool should be limited to committed Christians only. Like the people that you are thinking, can I date this person? When you're deciding to date a person, your dating pool is only to committed Christians. And that's it, according to what Scripture says. And so this means that somebody here, maybe you need to delete an app tonight off of your phone. Maybe there's somebody here that you need to delete a contact from somebody that's not good for you tonight off of your phone. And this is how we prepare to stay following God's way in this area in our life. And a lot of times what people do is they hear me say the simple things that I just said, but yet they don't take any of the steps of preparation. And what happens is failing to prepare is preparing to fail. In this area, that old line is very true. Failing to prepare is preparing to fail. And this is what happens with this individual in this Proverbs in chapter 5. And if we don't prepare, then what happens is we're deceived. We have all kinds of destruction in our lives. And ultimately, this passage that we read tonight in verses 9 through 14, it ends in despair. Lust, where's the end? It ends in despair. Look at verse 9 through 14. It says, lest you give your honor to others and your years to the merciless, lest strangers take their fill of your strength and your labors go to the house of a foreigner. And at the end of your life, you groan. When your flesh and body are consumed and you say, how I hated discipline and my heart despised reproof. I did not listen to the voice of my teachers or incline my ear to my instructors. I am at the brink of utter ruin in the assembled congregation. This passage, it ends in this place of regret and remorse and shame. And I would say at least 80 to 90% of the time, whenever I sit down with somebody, 80 to 90% at least, when they say, I've never told anybody this, but it's going to be something that they say that's in the realm of sexual sin. It's this thing that man, it gets this hold on our hearts, and it starts to do damage that we were just unaware of. We were unaware of the subscription that we were signing up for. That was starting to take a toll on us, and we find ourselves in this place of despair like this guy, and that's where I was at one point. My greatest regret in my life is in this area. Like I don't share stories about this stuff from my own life just to try to be lighthearted, man. Like it's actually difficult for me because it's the place of greatest regret. Like I wish things were, I wish the story read different. But here's what I've learned as I surrendered my life back over to Jesus. It says that he's at the brink of utter destruction. I want you to hear this. God can bring you back from the brink. Like God can bring you back from that. Like God can take, like the reason why we're reading this, the reason why he's warning in this passage, a father warning his child, isn't to fearmonger. It's actually because God wants to take you from, I wish I would have, to I'm glad I did. I wish I would have, like this guy saying, man, I wish I would have listened. No, God wants us to go from I wish I would have, which is a place where, man, I've said many times, man, I wish I would have done different there. I wish I would have done different in that situation. I wish I would have done different in the way I treated her. I wish I would have been different. But then I surrendered my life to Jesus, and he's taken me from I wish I would have to I'm glad that I did. For 4 years, we dated, me and my wife, and we were abstinent, seeking God together. And there was so much redemption in that. So much healing that happened in that. And maybe you're here and you're going, well, man, I can't even say that I'm able to do that. Maybe you're at a different place than even I was, and you go, man, I've just struggled here over and over and over again in one way or another. I want you to know, like, the last time could be the last time. Like, what if the last time that you fell was actually the last time because you finally said, God, I'm inviting you into this area of my life. And I'm going a new way now. And God can take you from I wish I would have to I'm glad that I did. And maybe you're here and like me, you have a lot of regret in your life. At least I did at one point. And here's the good news about Jesus. Jesus can turn our greatest regret into our greatest redemption. And that's where I want to end tonight. This is what Jesus can do. He can turn our greatest regret into our greatest redemption. He can bring us back from the brink. We don't have to go into utter destruction, as this passage says. And man, there's a story that I share every 2 years. I share it here. So this will be like my third or fourth time to share it here at the Way. And this will be the reason why I've shared this illustration more than any other is because of this. It's this illustration that I heard that caused the chains of shame to be broken over my life. And so I was listening to a sermon by a pastor named Matt Chandler. And Matt Chandler, he was talking about how he invited his friend to come to church with him. And this friend had, in particular, was somebody who had kind of been living wildly, specifically in the area of sexual immorality. And he was just trying to reach out to her and get her to come and hear about what Jesus has for her life. And so she decides that she'll go with him to this church service. And he didn't know and she didn't know that it was like this. It was kind of a message like what I'm sharing here tonight. It was like this message on sexual immorality. And so the guy, as he was starting to share the message, he took a rose. And this preacher, he took the rose and said, hey, as I begin the talk tonight, I just want you to take this rose and smell it and feel the petals and just kind of pass it along the room as I'm sharing. And so he goes and he shares his message, and he's getting to the most passionate point in the sermon. And as he's in his most passionate point, he goes, who has the rose? And so somebody brings the rose up to the front of the stage, and at this point, the rose was falling apart. Petals were barely there anymore because it had just been passed around. And he goes, you see this rose? Our sexuality is like this rose, is what he says. And he goes, who would want this broken rose? And at that point, I'm like, man, I'm the broken rose. Like I am what you're describing. And this pastor, this is where he left it, saying, who would want this? And Matt Chandler, next to his friend, said he felt like everything inside of him, he just wanted to stand up and scream, because you want to know who wants the rose? Who wants the rose? Who wants the broken rose? Jesus wants the broken rose. Jesus wants the rose. Why would Jesus want a broken road? Why would Jesus want a broken life like mine? Because he knows what he can do with it when we come to him and we say, Jesus, you can have it all. Because he knows that he can redeem. He knows that he can restore. He knows that he can renew. He knows that 2 Corinthians 5:17 says, if anyone's in Christ, that person's a new creation. The old is gone. Behold, the new has come. He knows that John chapter 10 verse 10 says, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. But I came that you may have life overflowing, life up to the full, life abundantly. Jesus wants the rose. And Jesus has redeemed my life. And my story reads different now. I'm the godly dad, and I can't believe I can say that. I'm an example of the kind of man that I want my daughters to marry one day. Not perfect, but man, I'm seeking to love their mommy. Jesus wants the rose, and he can redeem. In every area of your life, would you come to God and say, Jesus, here it is. Let's pray. God, thank you that you want the rose. Thank you that you died to pay the ultimate price to purchase that rose. And whenever you rose from the grave 3 days later, you showed that you were alive. And so our redemption is full and final, and we thank you.